Earlier this year, the U.S. Supreme Court issued a ruling in a police shooting that said basically the finders of fact should put themselves behind the eyes of the officer. And the first two experts to ring in for Cuyahoga County Prosecutor Tim McGinty on the Tamir Rice case have done just that with a good amount of controversy. That's the topic of discussion on today's Opinion Show, where we get together with the editorial board of the Plain Dealer and the Northeast Ohio Media Group for a chat. I'm here with Opinion Director Elizabeth Sullivan and editorial writers Pete Krause, Sharon Broussard, and Ted Dieden. So let's start off very quickly with a description of the news of this week. Betsy, if you could take us there.
Well, so Prosecutor McGinty, saying he wanted to be fully transparent, released the findings of two, and the full reports of two experts, one FBI and another a former prosecutor, retired prosecutor, on the essentially whether Officer Timothy Lohman was violated any constitutional issues in shooting Tamir. Their conclusion was based on the facts that are known about the situation he confronted at the point at which the patrol car was, basically yards away from Tamir Rice, who appeared from some of the evidence and accounts to be reaching for a weapon at his waist that looked like a real gun, that they were justified in shooting, and that the proximity and the fact that Timothy Lohman, whether he was in the patrol car or out of it, had little or no defense should he have shot at him, was the telling factor in that.
Yeah, before the disagreement on this begins, let's agree that what the two experts said was at the moment he jumps out of the car, he had a reasonable belief that the person sitting there reaching into his waistband appeared to be reaching for a
Correct.
gun, and an officer in that situation is reasonable in shooting, that any delay could
Correct.
Result in danger.
Within a 1 or 2 second.
So the controversy here is really not, I think, their conclusions, because their decisions were fairly narrowly drawn, but rather the prosecutor's decision to release these reports right away before other expert findings are in about other elements of a possible, criminal prosecution, and whether he's sort of easing the public's mind into the idea that Timothy Lohman will not be charged. So that's kind of what's kick-started a big community conversation about this. And one reason, we're planning to weigh in on this as well, but why we're sitting here, because it is important to kind of clear the air as to what these reports were, and I don't know that we can get into McGinty's mind, but maybe we should try.
Yeah, no, but I agree, because I think if the grand jury is told simply these are the parameters of what you're supposed to look at, was it justifiable, and did these cops feel they were in danger, then that's a different story than if he puts everything out there, the way the cops acted in terms of driving the car so quickly, whether or not, also what happened with the lack of information they had. I mean, you could weigh that either way, that, that kind of exonerates them because they were not told the full story, that some of the callers said he looked like he was just a kid.
Let's talk about that for a second, because a lot of the discussion now is about how they approached, and I'm going to play devil's advocate again, because somebody has to. You have two officers that are told there is a man waving a gun in a public park on a Saturday.
Did they say it was a man?
The call came in. A man waving a gun. They believed it was a man. They're not told a lot of the other stuff, so in their minds, they're driving up on a scene where a guy is waving a gun around, scaring people. They pull up very quickly, jump out of the car, and he gets shot. People are raising questions about the way they pulled up, and they haven't spoken, but there are exits from that park. And so if they had pulled up the way some are suggesting, there's a possibility that this man with the gun would run away and wreak havoc. And so it's possible that according to their training, they did the right thing. A whole lot of people are raising questions about that. So let's discuss that a bit.
And I want to make sure that we remember that one of the findings in the sheriff's investigation was that actually there was a an off-duty police officer working at that recreation center who had been in that job for years. And you would think that if somebody thought there was a disturbance of a man with a gun in the park of the recreation center where a Cleveland police officer is working on his own time, that somebody would actually call the recreation center and find out, what's going on.
Because weren't several kids were spending time with Tamir out there before this incident happened,
But
right?
the two cops that are driving up don't know this. All they know is they've been dispatched to a scene at a park on a Saturday. This is not an unusual thing in America anymore. Somebody with a gun in a park has to be taken seriously. They drive up to neutralize that threat. They don't know any of the other things you're talking about.
But I thought that some of the police experts that our reporters had contacted raised questions about the fact that they rolled up so quickly, that therefore the person was in, the cops are now in the line of fire, and you have to react, I think, you have to do something, as opposed to, better guidance on how to approach people with guns, which does not include putting your life in danger if it comes to that.
The call did say that he thought that he was threatening people with the weapon, but in fact
there was no one in the park.
But the call was they thought it was a fake gun. It was most likely a fake gun. And
the dispatcher did not convey that.
I was about to say,
yes,
the call taker took...
Well, not the dispatcher didn't, but the caller, the 911 caller
The two officers don't know that.
It did not get relayed to them.
But for instance, there was this incident in Oberlin Park where the couple both carrying guns wanted to make the point that you could carry your weapons in a public park anywhere. I mean, again,
nobody rolled up on them.
But they weren't flashing there. They weren't flashing.
The caller said he's aiming it at people and he's scaring me. And let's face it, if any of us had been in that park and saw him waving a gun around, we would have moved away from there. If this guy was legitimately scared.
And called police.
There were several experts that said, a lot of experts that say, the proper response would have been to pull up with cover, get out of the car, use the loudspeaker to get him to put down the gun. And if in fact that's the way they were trained, there are some who would argue that you could accuse them of negligence or dereliction of duty. And if that results in a death, does that result in another charge? But there is another factor here, in that in the months before this shooting, no less than the federal government issued a report that said Cleveland's training of its police is so bad that it is going to put officers, into deadly force situations that kill people because they don't have the right training.
There you go, Chris. That is it in a nutshell. I mean, clearly, if a police officer has to take a second or two to make a split-second decision on whether or not his life is in danger and to use deadly force, he makes it, and that's what this officer did. But he put himself, and those two officers put themselves in that position where they had no choice but to use deadly force. So really, the issue here is, as you say, whether or not they approached the situation properly, whether or not the dispatcher should have transferred more specific information. Maybe sometimes you don't want to say everything that a 911 caller says, because maybe that could lead the police officers to think that the situation is safer than it really is. I don't know the answer to that. But clearly, if you just look at this in a vacuum, the officer gets out. He believes this guy is reaching for a gun to shoot him. He has no choice. But what we're talking about is whether or not they approach this situation properly, whether or not they backed off a little bit, used a loudspeaker, taken cover, issued more demands. There's even a question now in one of these reports whether or not these demands were actually
issued. I was about to say that. It's not clear whether or not they talked to the...
The one thing we don't know, right, is what was said, because the police officers aren't talking, and Tamir obviously can't.
Well, but there are witnesses, and the witness versions conflict, and some of them contend that there was a warning, but that it came after the sound of firing.
It's not much use then, but I was astonished when I saw the video. I was astonished when I found out that the loudspeaker hadn't been used, because I thought what would have happened would have been the cop car rolls up, they're telling him through the loudspeaker to back away, or then
Put your hands up.
they get out of the car. He approaches, reaches for that would be understandable, but that didn't happen.
One of the issues that Chris has now put on the table is whether the fundamental problem is failures by the Cleveland Police Department to train officers adequately.
Yeah.
Does that then put their officers in criminal jeopardy in cases like this, or is that an affirmative defense against an indictment?
It could
I
be
don't
an
know.
affirmative offense against an indictment of an individual officer, but it clearly underscores the absolute need for more training in what came out of this consent decree, and that is a better way of policing.
All right, but let's bring it back. Tim McGinty has a very difficult situation as to whether or not charges can be brought against these two officers. And there's a U.S. Supreme Court precedent this year that says you have to put yourself into the place of the officer from their perspective to decide if what they did was reasonable. We haven't heard from the officers, but there is every possibility they will say, we considered it a legitimate threat, and this is what we thought we had to do to neutralize it.
I actually think that you cannot say that it's only about the officer's perspective, because of course every officer who fires his weapon or her weapon is going to say, I felt I was in threat, okay? So that is not necessarily the be-all and the end-all, and I don't think that
if you go back and read the Supreme Court, it's not, you can't be unreasonable, but if these officers can articulate, and they haven't, again, spoken, if they can articulate reasons why they felt that approach was the necessary maneuver to neutralize that threat, and then the shooting ensues, that's a very difficult thing to indict on and bring in.
I agree with that, but it's not the only consideration. If in fact, the best practices, the training, all the normal and prudence that you would expect from a police officer all point to a different way of handling it, there could be a possible charge. And we haven't even talked about the fact that Tamir lay there for minutes without any first aid after he was shot, because these officers, again, didn't have the requisite training and first aid equipment in their cars.
Look, it appears that they went about this in the way that Dirty Harry would. Charge in there and resolve the situation with gunfire. I mean, and that's not the way you do it in real life.
I think that's mind reading. None of us know what exactly the Lomans saw and what was said, and
you are correct.
That,
but
it's
we're
important
vacuum then to a certain extent.
Well, yeah, and it's important to reel back and say, to these reports that we're sitting here talking about, that none of that those deal only with the action after the car stops and he gets out and sees what he sees, and that's going to be the difficulty in bringing charges against these
and I was about to say, Chris, that I think you're right that with the law says that you should put yourself in the shoes of a police officer, but I also think a grand jury of ordinary citizens who generally don't go out and confront anybody with a gun also puts themselves kind of like emotionally with the police officer, which could make it very difficult to come to an indictment. But I think on the civil side, this is like rife for lots of money.
Oh, yeah.
If I put myself in the shoes of a police officer, I would rather not shoot somebody than shoot
No, it's not. It's not saying that they would rather or not shoot anyone. It's that they would feel that this is a situation that if it were me and this had happened, I would shoot, and therefore I cannot see putting someone away for 25, 30 years or whatever.
And I think that McGinty is in a very difficult position here too, because the community sees the big picture and all the things that have come out about this case. Right. The hiring of Officer Lohman without sufficient checking into his background.
Right. The
and
lack
I
of
noticed that a
training.
lot of people commented on that, on our story, that was one of the strong, reactions. Is like, how can you justify what this guy did because of his back? Well, because it doesn't actually play a role in a criminal situation.
Right, they didn't look at that.
This points out all sorts of things that are wrong. We could go through and break this down and come up with a dozen ways this went wrong. The question is, does it rise to the level of a crime? And that's a tough one.
And that's going to be tough. And it's going to be tough if, he takes it to the grand jury and they don't indict, and the community is going to be really outraged about that.
Well, do you think, I've just railed against mind reading, but I'm wondering why McGinty has reeled these reports out rather than waiting, and
Well,
I don't know if that's typical. And I know he says that's you know, for in the interest of transparency, but I also wonder if looking ahead to what's liable to happen, at least if not likely, you know, he wants people to be able to process this information and talk about it, and as it goes out, so we don't come all the way up to what happens at the indictment or non-indictment, and wham, you know, there you are. You know, so.
But I mean,
Softening
he has
things.
been issuing things that was very unprecedented, that he issued the full Sheriff's Department investigation with all of the
That's unusual,
documentation, very unusual, and he did issue that right away. So I do think you're right. He's like laying the groundwork so that there, you know, maybe fewer surprises.
Isn't this is what happened in Ferguson, though, too, when the prosecuting attorney came out and
that's
laid
true.
out all
Yeah.
of the reports and the groundwork and the evidence from the grand jury, you know, before saying that for these reasons we're not going to indict. And I think McKinney's doing something similar. But I would point out one other thing, and we just going back to the whole consent decree, you know, where they looked at the way Cleveland's police department operates. And this Tamir Rice situation played no role in that because it came after.
Oh, that's a good point.
You know what I mean?
And
so what does that tell you? I mean,
and I just want to say, you know, when we talk about the law and grand juries and indictments and all that, you know, maybe we're a little bit forgetting that there's a kid here who was buried way too early, who, if everything had gone well and better police procedures had been used, you could argue might be alive today to talk about his experience at school and how not to do it again. And that's something we just can't forget.
That's where a lot of people are coming from, too.
Yeah.
You know, there's a 12-year-old who's dead, he shouldn't be, and somebody needs to be punished for it.
Right.
And the minds of a lot of people. And you know,
All right, we'll have to leave
that's
it there. We've gone long.
Have to go.
I'd love to hear
That's
your
for sure.
thoughts. Please leave them in the comments on this post. We'll see you next time.